Now we will hear from Mia McGraith-Burns about her joint work with Mark Shephard.
So our research is focused on evaluating priority congruence between the public and political parties in questions put to the Prime Minister during PMQs and People's PMQs. So the focus of the research is sort of determining what motivates the issue, like why MPs mention certain issues and not other issues. So as a high-profile element of UK parliamentary procedure, PMQs has been criticised on the grounds that MPs focus on party point scoring rather than expressing the concerns of the public or scrutinising the government. So these criticisms are reflective of a sort of wider feeling of disconnection between the public and the political system. So in 2019, Boris Johnson introduced People's Prime Minister questions, which is sort of an extension of traditional Prime Minister's questions, which was set to take place weekly on Facebook Live and give people an opportunity to put their questions to the Prime Minister. So it was sort of billed as a solution to this problem of feelings of disconnection by allowing a direct line to the Prime Minister, although it's also been criticised because the question selection process is undisclosed, and some have even likened it to propaganda because it's bypassing media and MP scrutiny. So based on this, we've formed 3 research questions. The first is related to determining whether or not the priorities of the public are represented by questions put to the Prime Minister in PMQs. And the second asks the same questions about the questions in People's Prime Minister questions. And then the third question we looked to address was, what is the function of this new process, People's PMQs? So looking to existing theory, we wanted to develop an understanding of how parties compete and how this informs what they discuss publicly, and in turn, how does that impact their ability to link their priorities with that of the public. So first of all, to consider party goals, some would consider the main goal of a party is to maximise votes, but this doesn't really explain why sometimes unpopular platforms are adopted or why not all parties cater to the median voter. So instead, we consider it to be their operation to be a trade-off between different goals. So a main aspect of political competition is issue emphasis, and this is the process through which parties selectively highlight certain issues over other in political competitions, and it also shapes how parties are viewed by the public. So issue emphasis is a useful alternative for investigating party competition, especially in times of like ideological congruence. And there are 2 main theories which explain issue emphasis. The first is issue ownership. So issue ownership theory suggests that in competition, parties will emphasise issues which are tailored to their own strengths, and that is the issues that they own. So owning an issue is based on the party priorities and their past performance on issues, and owning an issue will give a party an electoral advantage on this issue because they can field strong arguments and dominate political discussions comfortably. So it's based on the psychological premise of confirmatory bias, which states that more people are more likely to engage with content which reinforces their beliefs. So if a party is talking about an issue which the public believes that they are competent on, then that will reinforce their competence. The second theory is wave riding theory, which predicts that parties will focus on the issues which are most important to voters, essentially riding the wave of public opinion. This can be considered a rational choice approach to issue emphasis because they're adjusting their priorities in response to environmental incentives. So in the past, these theories have sort of been applied in various contexts, investigating issue emphasis in electoral campaigns as well as day-to-day politics. And a few conclusions that can be drawn about factors and characteristics which seem to influence how a party chooses to emphasise certain issues. So first of all, it's worth noting that parties can't ignore the most salient issues altogether, but they might avoid salient issues, as in issues which are important to the public, if they're owned by their opposition party. When competition is close, parties will seek to address the issues which are most important to the public, and less popular parties in these circumstances will be more confined to discussing their owned issues. Mainstream parties with greater resources are more suitably able to ride the wave of public opinion, and opposition parties are arguably better at representing the public, although this seems to weaken when parties get into government because they're constrained by the need to govern responsibly, so it's less likely that they'll ride the wave of public opinion. So based on these this previous research, we've formed the following hypothesis. So the first is related to how the governing party will perform during PMQs, and we expected that MPs from the governing party will ask the Prime Minister questions based on their own issues, so the issues that they perform strongly on. In terms of the opposition party at PMQs, we expected that they'll show a greater focus of the public priorities, and also that they'll avoid the issues owned by the governing party, which are likely more popular. For People's Prime Minister's questions, because it's a new procedure, it's somewhat unique, and because the questions are self-selected, we expected that the questions would reflect the priorities of the government, and as the leader of the government, the Prime Minister is also constrained by a level of responsibility, so it is unlikely still that they'll avoid the issues which are most important to the public, such as Brexit. So in order to evaluate our hypothesis, we used content analysis, and we conducted a content analysis of 3 sessions of Prime Minister's questions and 3 of People's Prime Minister questions. So these 3 sessions occurred on 3 consecutive weeks, and there was overlap between, so the PMQs and People's PMQs occurred in the same weeks also. So in order to gather data about the priorities of the public, we used pre-existing YouGov polling, which tracked the most important issues to the public within this 3-week period, which remained stable. And in terms of issue ownership, this was also based on opinion polls about which parties best deal with which issues. And this table down here just references the 15 issues which these polls categorised and which were considered to be owned by each party. So in order to determine the government's priorities, we just focused on the Conservative Party manifesto from 2019. So during our coding process, all the questions were coded for which party the MP was from, so either Labour or Conservative. We focused on the 2 main parties just because that was where there was available information about issue ownership. And for dependent variable, that was just based on those 15 issues which I've discussed there. And we carried out coder reliability checks in which there was no discrepancies in a sample of 20%. So moving on to our core findings, from Prime Minister's questions, you can see from the figures on the screen here, both parties were most likely to raise issues which were owned by their own party, although there's obviously like a bit of disparity here. The opposition party tended to focus more often on their own issues, whereas the Conservative Party, there was a more even distribution across issues which they owned and issues which they didn't own. The opposition party also seemed to avoid Conservative issues more often, so only 11% of their questions were related to Conservative issues, whereas 31% of Conservative questions were related to Labour issues. So interestingly, we also found that there was a significant focus on the issue of transport by Conservative MPs, so 21% of questions over the 3 weeks were about the issue of transport. So this issue is neither owned by the Conservative Party nor was it particularly important to the public. So that suggests there might be some other factors at play. Related to People's Prime Minister questions, because there was a fewer number of questions, our statistical analysis wasn't particularly conclusive. It did show that the 2 most important issues to the public, which were health and Brexit, were mentioned most frequently. But there was quite a narrow gap between these and the distribution of other issues. Interestingly, there was 4 questions which were totally unrelated to politics. So 2 of them here asked Boris Johnson personal questions like, what shampoo do you use, or do you like tea or coffee? I think there was also a question about what he was going to do to celebrate Brexit on the 21st of January. So probably the most stark finding from People's Prime Minister's questions was that there was considerable overlap between the manifesto priorities set out in Boris Johnson's guarantee, which was on page 1 of the manifesto, and the questions that were asked during People's PMQs. So this table here just shows 3 of the points. So there's 7 points in total in the guarantee, and each of these points was mentioned at least once in a question during People's Prime Minister's questions. And here's just 3 examples here. It shows direct reference to the 50,000 nurses figure, direct reference to the points-based immigration system, and again to more policing and tougher sentencing. So in conclusion, if we refer back to our original research questions, firstly, in terms of public priorities at Prime Minister's questions, both parties did include questioning about most important issues, but the picture overall is somewhat unclear, although we can say that issue ownership better explains rather the behaviour of Labour Party MPs. More data is needed to draw substantial conclusions about this. In terms of the public's priorities at People's Prime Minister's questions, the top priorities of health and Brexit were discussed in the questions put to the Prime Minister, which we did expect because it would be unlikely that he would avoid them because he's responsible as the leader of the country. But questions most frequently reflected government priorities based on manifesto promises. So in terms of determining the function of People's Prime Minister's questions, because the questions are related to the manifesto, it's likely that they're going to be more comfortable for the Prime Minister to answer. Also because his people are choosing the questions and there are no supplementary questions, there's nothing unexpected or difficult coming at him. So in turn, it seems to be more of a platform about the party and the leader expressing their concerns and priorities and sort of showboating what they are going to do rather than an opportunity to respond to scrutiny. So there's a few limitations in our research. Probably the main one was that we used quite a small sample size. This was because People's Prime Minister's questions was a relatively new procedure at the time, and it was disrupted by both the general election in December 2019 and also subsequently by the coronavirus pandemic. It was originally billed as a weekly process, but it actually only occurred weekly in that 3-week period that we've discussed, and it hasn't returned to a weekly format since, but there has been 2 more this year. Another limitation is that contextual factors, there was no measures for those in our research. They might have influenced questions, so issues such as what was current in the media at the time or bills that were passing through Parliament. And also it's worth noting that because Prime Minister questions is such a high profile event, ministers might want to omit contentious or unpopular issues in favour of raising sort of nicer ones to talk about, such as health. So as a next step, obviously these additional factors could be incorporated. We could also potentially use measures of how difficult questions are to answer. For example, previous research has used standard, unanswerable and helpful as 3 standards for how difficult questions are to answer. So standard questions are more straightforward, unanswerable or deliberately difficult or provoke discomfort, and helpful questions are questions which prompt the Prime Minister to set out a government position, kind of like the ones we saw in People's Prime Minister's questions. And also our research only focused on the 2 main parties, so it might be useful in the future to include questions asked by all political parties in the UK rather than just Labour and Conservative. So that's this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia. That was a fascinating analysis and spot on time.